program. I am so excited to do this presentation with my friend, my colleague, Rabbi Hadas on Zaris, who is joining us. As those of us who were here on the call, heard from Kibbutz Yifat, which is near Afula in Israel. I'm going to read Hadas's biography from the Hartman website. She is a founding member of Hamidrasha, where she is a co-director and instructor of Amitei Kihila, a community spiritual leader training program. Hadas lectures at Oranim Academic College, where she supervises and mentors students who are studying and working with teenagers at risk. She earned her MA in Couples and Family Therapy from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and received her rabbinic ordination from the Shalom Hartman Institute HaMidrasha et Oranim Beit Midrash for Israeli Rabbis, and she is the spiritual leader of Yifat Beruach, a Jewish Israeli community in the Israel Valley. And I just want to say, most importantly, she is my chevruta, she is my study partner, my friend, and I want to thank you for joining us. I'll just share with everybody what I'm going to sort of do the first part of this presentation, and I'm going to share our itinerary, and I've invited Hadas to interrupt me or to jump in, and we'll sort of see where it goes as I describe the day in Hevron that was created for us as part of our curriculum at the Shalom Hartman Institute. What I want to do is just sort of begin by saying that for me, Hevron is it's probably the most intense place in Israel. I think that it's a center of not only sort of, as we'll talk about, of religious significance, but in a way that even Jerusalem seems to not do. It draws extremists, it draws a conflict in a way that that almost is like nowhere else in the state of Israel and the land of Israel and Palestine. And we included it on our interfaith trip because it was important for us as we crafted the itinerary that people should have sort of as eyes wide open as possible, that we not be afraid of some of the more difficult truths that are part of the reality of the state of Israel. And I think that it was included in the Hartman program as part of our itinerary for similar reasons. And so I use all of that by an introduction just to say that by zooming in and spending a day thinking about Hevron, there are ways in which that provides clarity, and there are also ways in which it distorts, because it would be a misrepresentation to say that all of Israel is like Hevron. It's not. There's a lot to Israel that is much more moderate and much more beautiful in a variety of ways. And so I just think we need to keep that in mind, that that this is I sort of think of it as zooming in on a small part of the picture, trying to establish some clarity about what's there, but also reminding ourselves that that there's a bigger context and that there's a lot going on that we're not seeing, even as we focus in on what we are seeing. I hope that makes sense. Hadas, do you want to add anything to that before I'm gonna share our itinerary for the day?
First of all, I want to say thank you for you all and Daniel for your invitation. It's really touching to be here. And I want to say that I'm not an expert in Hebron, and to say something that's for your introduction, that I told Daniel that if we didn't go. Sorry, I'm apologize about my not so good English, but I told Daniel that I didn't go to Hebron for 40 years, I think already. And I represent my friends, my people, the secular left side from Israel, from the north, from kibbutzim and from Zionists going to the army, but we are not traveling to Hebron. It's so hard to be there and it's so difficult. And I felt like going there, I really appreciate that my North America colleague went there and I went with them. It was like really shocking because when I was a child, I used to go to Hebron because I live in that was the way to Jerusalem. So we used to go across Hebron and it looked different, totally different. And it felt like even I was a child, so I felt like it's like peace or like very normal to go through there, go to the shops there. But since the Intifada, and not even before, since when I was in the army, I didn't go there. So that's from the beginning of what the experience was to go together, to be one day. But it's in one way, it's not represent Israel. I agree with you, it's the most painful, difficult place in Israel, not in Israel, depends what you think about it. Then, but it's affects all the society of Israel.
Well, I think, and we'll talk more about that. And I think I appreciate also, Hadas, what you said. Neither of us are international scholars. Neither of us are bring a particular expertise to Hevron. I think I have been there. I think this was my third time going there. I've been there in a variety of contexts. One day I spent a full day a number of years ago doing a tour of the West Bank with Palestinians. And so I actually had the opportunity to visit some refugee camps and to visit a school in East Jerusalem, and also to enter what I'll talk about, to enter the Cave of the Patriarchs from the Palestinian side of Hevron. But I'm not an expert. I felt that it was important to share this experience. And also, I just want to say thanks to Hadas, because I think that American Jews and Israelis really experience a lot of things differently, but one of them is a place like Hevron, and also, as Hadas said, the effect that it has on Israeli society, I think is something for us all to be aware of. So I want to just do two things. I want to do a lot of things, but the first thing I have up here on the screen is just a little picture of our itinerary. And I think I'll figure out a way to put that into the chat. But I have some pictures, and I also took some pictures that day, which I will show to you from it, and use this as a framework for walking through the day. So we began, the first thing, maybe I'll stop and share a different screen. I took some photographs, as you saw. Well, that's Hadas's biography, which is wonderful. Let me find, that's my email, which I don't think you can see. But here is, here is a beginning of the day. So I took a picture of this as we were driving. Not every road looks like this, but you should understand that as you go through the West Bank, there are roads that are constructed with these barriers, and these barriers exist essentially there you can see that the concrete sort of leans over the road in that way, and that makes it even more difficult not only to climb over but also to throw rocks over. And so the roads, this is an example of how the roads through the West Bank, on the one hand, some of these roads have made transportation easier because there's less interaction between Jews and Palestinians. And when there's less interaction, part of what that means is that there are fewer checkpoints and fewer, and therefore fewer interruptions of Palestinians' daily lives. But also, sometimes those roads are going through areas, and this is what has been necessary to create. We started, so that's just like a little thing about going into the West Bank. We started out the truth is in kind of an extraordinary place. That the Hebrew here says kever rut v'yishai. With a lot of these historical places, there are, I guess what I would say is, there are traditions that these are the tombs of different figures. Some of the traditions are stronger and some of them are less strong. So, for example, I was speaking with somebody yesterday who was telling me about, actually, Lori, I think it was your husband, Jack, who was telling me about Sainte Caterina, which is a monastery at the bottom of what is called Mount Sinai, right? Now, the truth is that there's a monastery at the bottom of a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. We know that it's the Sinai Peninsula, but there's no archaeological record that the place where they put the monastery is actually Mount Sinai, right? It's actually connected to that. And where, on the other hand, we know with certainty that for example, the Temple Mount, it is very clearly the temple, right, as it's described. That is the location, and we know for sure that that's there. But I would say those are on two poles, right? And here there's something which is kever rut v'yishai. Ruth is Ruth, right, from the book of Ruth. And Yishai is when you say David ben Yishai, right? King David, right? Father, the son of Yishai. So this was understood to be the tombs of Ruth and Yishai, two very important historical figures. And that's part of what is understood to exist in Hevron, right? Whether or not those are actually, I think it's the historical veracity of whether or not it's the actual tomb of Ruth is probably not as strong, for example, as the veracity around the cave of the Patriarchs. But nevertheless, there's at least some ascription of Ruth and Yishai being there. In Hevron, so this is a picture of one of the Israeli soldiers who guards the area in Hevron. You can see he's very heavily armed, and there are bases that are sort of there where they stay. Let me fast forward here for a second to some other pictures. Yeah, so this picture gives you kind of a bigger view of the city of Hebron. The city of Hebron is it is 150,000 people, approximately. I did a little bit of research. It may have grown some. My numbers may be a little bit off, but approximately 150,000 people. More of the history is that the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. And then in 1997, I think it was either 96 or 97, there was something called the Y Accords. They were called the Y Accords because they were signed at the Y Plantation, which I think is actually somewhere in Maryland. And they were negotiated by Bibi Netanyahu This was in his first term as prime minister after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha. And Bill Clinton was then the president. And it was understood to sort of be the next step in the Oslo Accords to try and come up with a final status agreement of Hevron. What was created with Hevron were essentially two areas. And let me just take I believe I always get them mixed up. Hadas, maybe if you remember, one of them is H1 and one of them is H2. And I believe that H1 is 80% Palestinian. So if there are 100 and I think the numbers are something like 120,000 Palestinians live in Hebron, and it's geographically is 80% of the area. And it's when I say Palestinian, I don't just mean the Palestinians live there, but that the Palestinian Authority has essentially full control over the area. And what I mean by full control is that the Palestinian Authority police the area. The Palestinian Authority approves things like zoning and building permits and other things like that. And the Palestinian Authority collects taxes and sort of does all of those things. And that is the situation in most, part of what the Oslo Accords did is that is the situation in most of the large cities in the West Bank. For example, the area H1 of Hevron is comparable to what is the case in Ramallah, which is another, I think it may be the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. It's the same thing in Bethlehem. It's the same thing in Jenin. It's the same thing in Nablus. In the major cities in the West Bank, part of what the Accords did is create areas that are areas of mostly self-rule for the Palestinians. Hadas, I see you came off of mute. Let me just explain the H2 and then please jump in. H2 was an area that is 20% of the population. There are approximately 30,000 people who live there. Most of them are Palestinian. And there are essentially four Jewish enclaves that were that are kind of contiguous, and they were set up for number one, the historical Jewish connections and even some historical Jewish neighborhoods in Hebron, and also to facilitate access both to what's called Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and then some other archaeological sites. The number of Palestinians who actually live in H2, which is different, which is under Israeli police and Israeli military control, and it was intended to be an area that where essentially Jews and Palestinians live together, Jews and Muslims live together. A lot of the Palestinian population has decreased because it is very difficult for the Palestinians who live there. They live, the number one, the relations that they have on the whole with their Jewish neighbors are not good, and a lot of the freedoms that they, in terms of buildings, there have been whole streets that have been shut down and other things, such that it's just not a nice place for Palestinians to live. And so there's been, I think, a marked decrease in the population that was there, in the Palestinian population that was there. So again, you have two. I just want to, for now, what you're looking at is a very large Palestinian city. 80% of it is under Palestinian Authority control, and 20% of it is under Israeli control with some Jews, some Jewish neighborhoods, and some Jewish holy sites. So it's just like setting the table. Hadas, what you wanted to jump in? Was there something you wanted to add? I'm doing my best on that part.
You're doing great. I remember that when we look on the city, in the big city, we saw 4 places that belong to Jewish. There is settlement in the middle of the city. Most of it is Palestinian, but 4 places that they are like muvlat, we say in Hebrew, like an island between in the middle of the city. So it's more than like 80% controlled by Palestinian and 20 by a Jewish army, because it's like in the middle of the city. Imagine that's what the feeling like. We look from the place we saw it's spread. They're not living in one place that's only in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Spread for 4 places, and in the places that there is settlement of Jewish people, they're guarding by soldier around them that is control the Arabic society.
Right, and I appreciate that it's not like 80% over here and 20% just in a corner. The 20% is really in the middle of the city, and what it does is it creates, where if somebody wants to go from one side of the city to the other, they sort of have to go all the way around, right? It really is, it has created discontinuity, right, in the city itself. So the next part that I want to do is I'm going to pull up the itinerary here for a second, and I think what I want to say is that I don't think that Hadas and I necessarily had like different experiences of this. I do think that we might assign different value to it, and I'm not even sure what value I assign to it, but what I thought was very important about the trip that we took is that I thought that it did a very nice job of sort of giving a full voice to a lot of what makes Hevron such a complicated place. So the truth is that while it says Cape of the Patriarchs first, we actually, as you saw, went up to the top, and we saw Tel Rumedi and the ancient Jewish cemetery first. And what I want to just pull up here is, I showed you this picture, but I took a couple of pictures of essentially the archaeological ruins that are in Hevron. And you can see the little sign here says Tel Hevron excavations. And if you look very carefully, you can see that what they have found in Hevron from an archaeological perspective is pretty extraordinary. You see here, there's a sign that says city wall from the early Bronze Age, about 4,500 years ago, okay? And I guess, and it says here, street early Bronze Age and something else, residential structures early Bronze Age. And oftentimes, I just want to say out loud that archaeology and politics are mixed in Israel. There's always some politics in this, but I also want to say, like, they're not making this up, right? In other words, when it says here that they have a wall from 4,500 years ago, nobody came in and planted these stones. In other words, this is legitimate archaeology. There's carbon dating behind this. And so in this tell, what you have is essentially, you have the remains of the city, of the ancient city of Hevron. So when we read in Parshat Shlach Lecha, when we read in the book of Numbers that Moses sends 12 spies to the land, and they come to Hevron, and they go, wow, this is like a very fortified city. What you can, what they have found is, yes, the dating of this goes back very, very far, 4,500 years ago, places it even before the Exodus, right? I mean, you're talking about a very, very early, early city, a Canaanite city before the Israelite entrance into the land. And you can see that it's pretty extraordinary. And what they've done here is to try to fill out for you sort of what might it have looked like. So this is painted on a wall behind it, but these are the walls and everything that have actually been found. They sort of pointed out to us that part of what they found, they found part of a street that if they sort of dug out under everything, they could actually show you the main street of Hevron. And you see here the steps leading to the city gate are right here. And, just for like a little bit of historical, going back to Parshat Chaye Sarah, when Abraham gets to the land of Israel, he meets the Hittite named Ephron, and he goes to the city gate and he purchases Ma'arat HaMachpelah, a cave and the field near it, for the burial of Sarah. This is the first piece of land that was owned by, he wasn't yet Jewish, he was an Israelite, or he was just Abraham, but bought by somebody within that story. And it's pretty clear, right? Like, what's extraordinary is if you followed those steps, if you like dug it all out, you would get to the gate. At some point, you would get to the city gate, and you could say with, I don't know, some level of certainty that that's where Abraham and Ephron negotiated, right? Negotiated the purchase. And where we were, just so you understand, all cemeteries, right? People buried the dead outside of the main city. And so where this is the top of it's at the ancient city, and then the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the Patriarchs, is about a mile away through the modern city of Hevron. And it all makes sense, right? Because it would exist outside of the walled city of Hevron. The same way, for example, that the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem is a cemetery that's outside of the walled city of Jerusalem. So this is, you can just see a little bit more where they found the ancient city, and then like, okay, there's a modern road, so they're not going to dig that up, but if they followed that, that's where it would go. And another thing that we saw at the beginning of the day were extraordinary archaeological ruins. Hadas, I think that's you. And I'm just going to fast forward a little bit to some of the biggest mikvahs that exist in the land of Israel. So this is actually a mikvah. And I learned something that I didn't know before. I thought that all mikvahs had 7 steps, but it's not true, and it's not a requirement. And you can see, you can't quite see here, but there are a lot more than 7 steps. But you can see this is they've sort of done a recreation of what this probably looked like in the early Roman period. You can see there's 3 sets of stairs going down, and there was an Eastern ritual bath over here, and then a Western ritual bath. So this was like a very, very big area that has all been, has tremendous archaeological significance and historical historical experience. And here you can see sort of the 3 stairways and a 4th for this mikvah. This is a picture of our tour guide is sort of showing us this wall is the remains of what probably looked something like that. And it was essentially the walled city of Hevron, right? It was the city wall for the city of Hevron. There's a beautiful picture of Hadas. I included that. I love that, with a wonderful, wonderful olive tree that she's sitting at the base of, and she's looking very, very, very thoughtful in that picture. So I guess what the thing, and this is, and let me just skim through my pictures for a second. I'm not sure exactly what I have, but this is more of the larger city of Hevron. Okay, and now this is one of these pictures that I took at Ma'arat HaMachpelah. So we've now gotten to Ma'arat HaMachpelah. So something
Daniel,
yeah, go ahead, Hadas.
Can I jump just
Please.
because you invite me, so I just want to mention, because we are not going back to Tel Romeda, that it was really shocking. It was amazing archaeology. But in the same time, there is people living there, actually, Jewish people, in a caravan, and one of them is from the Chaver Knesset, was Baruch Marzel, like was very Kahana. Baruch Kahana is one of, we sat near his place, and what we didn't go to see, but near the ruin, near the archaeological places, that's really amazing. There is a Mayan, water, how you say Mayan?
A spring.
Yeah. That's all the people, all the Arabic people who live there, the shepherd, and they need this water. And it's all the time fighting between Arabic and Jewish people who live there in Tel Romeda, and the soldier have to separate them. And remember that, because I won't interrupt now, but it is very tense place. It's very tense, and it bring many conflict for the soldier. That's when the Jewish people, when there is fighting, if they involve the settler, complain about them, and it's really place that bring every day, daily conflict between Arabic and Jewish. Is very tense, and there is many soldiers there. And I just spoke with a friend that was in the army in Tel Romeda, and he told me it was so difficult to be there. It was like, so just to give my point of view.
No, I really appreciate that. Yes, there are archaeological ruins, but there's a neighborhood there, and there are 4 different neighborhoods. You know, and I think, Hadas, when we get to the breaking the silence, we'll talk sort of more about those, you know, about those elements of it. You know, what I appreciated, you know, again, just to come back to, so like there's pretty extraordinary archaeology. And then another piece of what we saw was Ma'arat HaMachpelah. Ma'arat HaMachpelah has its own history to it, that the cave of the Patriarchs, you know, including just, you know, Hadas, to your point, in 1990, what year was Baruch Goldstein? Was it 94 or 93?
I remember it's happened. I don't remember the date.
Yes, but was a massacre by a Jewish doctor of Muslims at prayer, and in the wake of that massacre,
it was happened in Purim.
It happened on Purim, right?
Yeah.
Which is a holiday that has a lot of violence associated with the story.
Yeah.
And in the wake of that, the mosque, the configuration of, so one thing that's very, very interesting to me is that before that, the Cave of the Patriarchs essentially acted as a shared synagogue and mosque, where Jews and Muslims were at prayer together in various ways, but without a lot of the separation that now exists. Now there exists a fascinating agreement. One of the most fascinating pieces of this is that 85%, I'm going to talk about a few elements of this. In terms of the physical space of the Cave of the Patriarchs, 85% of the physical space is a mosque, and 15% is a synagogue. So, strangely, we had to divide up the matriarchs and patriarchs between the religions. So most of the time, the graves of Abraham and Sarah, and I think it's Jacob and Leah, are with the synagogue, are accessible to the Jews, and Isaac and Rebekah are accessible most of the time to the Muslims. There are 2 weeks a year when the entire area is cleared out from any synagogue stuff and used 100% as a mosque. I imagine, I'm not sure, but I imagine that's during Ramadan. And then there are 2 weeks a year where the entire mosque is cleared out and the entire area is used as a synagogue for Jews, which I imagine, I'm going to guess, is around maybe Pesach and Sukkot or something like that. I'm not sure of the exact times. But I have to say that that's a fast, there's actually something to me that's deeply hopeful. If there's anything hopeful about the experience of Hevron, it's like the fact that the sacred spaces, that there is a mechanism for sharing them. I think it's a very, we had our prayers in a church for a year, and that was amazing, right? Like they cleared out, a couple of crosses, and we stepped in and made a holy space there. And there's just something extraordinary about that, and even hopeful in the middle of a place which is just kind of crazy making. But that is the arrangement in Ma'arat HaMachpelah. I'll show you this. And again, the whole area and the whole sort of history behind this goes back many, goes back a couple of thousand years. There is sort of a building that's built up, and the cave, the actual cave where the actual graves are, is, you actually don't see it. They're sort of underneath this bigger structure. But I'll show you, I took a few pictures of, there's a husband and wife at prayer, and a man who's sort of deeply at prayer in the synagogue. And so this is just sort of a view of what it looks like in the synagogue area. And then I decided, it's very, very hard, but there are steel doors, and there's like a little crack in this steel door, and I put my iPhone camera up, and so on the right and left hand side you can see the steel doors, but I was able to peek through, and here's a little girl. And then you can see that people are at prayer. There are Muslims at prayer, on the carpet through there. And I wanted to catch a picture of that. And then here's a picture of me with, at the area marking the grave of Abraham, of Avraham Avinu, right, of Abraham, our ancestor. And this is a picture of essentially the building where all of that is. And as I was saying, the Cave of the Patriarchs is, the actual cave is probably below there somewhere. I'm going to say one other thing, sort of, I guess, leaning in a particular direction, which is another element of this area, is that outside of the mosque, there is a place where there are 7 stairs, okay? And those 7 stairs were essentially where Jews could pray for several thousand years while the while the cave was under either Christian rule or Muslim rule. And basically, when the cave was under Christian or Muslim rule, Jews were not permitted access to inside at the Cave of the Patriarchs. We were only permitted access to these 7 stairs that are lower and outside. And it was, like much of Christianity and Islam, unfortunately, it was a sign that it was lifted up as a sign for Christians that the covenant of God with the Jews had ended, and that and it was sort of displaying the way in which Jews were persecuted or were lower, was a sign of the victory of Christianity. And in Islam, the Jews lived as fairly peaceably, and they lived as what's called dhimmi, as sort of second-class citizens, not third class. We were monotheists, but second class, and denied access to a holy place. Sort of said, you can come here and no further. I say all of that. I think I, like Hadas, I'm not. I don't spend a lot of time sort of making pilgrimage to holy places, to the graves of holy people, and things like that. I hold these things much more lightly, with some reverence, but also just sort of with the sense of it's a place, right? And it's not, not more than that. And right, there is a piece of me which says that there was a profound injustice that was perpetuated against the Jewish people for several thousand years, and that there's a profound justice in Jews having access to a holy place, having access to a place of our history, of not being second-class citizens, and that while the day of Baruch Goldstein was a stain on the Jewish people and something horrible, this agreement does provide access, fair access religiously for Muslims and for Jews together, and for any Christians who want to go. And we do know that, unfortunately, in a lot of when, for example, Jordan controlled the West Bank from 1948 to 67, Jews had no access to this place. And figuring out, right, what is the way in which Jews can, possibly have access, or that the Jewish historical connection, religious connection can be preserved, is one question, right, among many questions. And the cost that inflicts is something that, I think Hadas can speak a lot to. I just wanted to sort of I appreciated that our tour showed us the richness of the archaeology, showed us the connection, showed us some of the, some of that, and raised important questions, okay? So this is a picture as an example of when Hadas was saying that it runs through the middle of the city and that you have to sort of block off access. This is a wall that's sort of like right there in the middle of the city that keeps Palestinians from being able to walk from one place to the other. This is a little picture that I saw on a wall when we went. The next place in the itinerary that we went to was a place called Beit Hadassah, where we met with a guy named Yishai Fleischer, who, as you see here, is the international spokesman for the Jewish community of Hevron in Israel. And just to give you a little sense of who he is, I believe not long ago he was at I don't know whether it was a Christian Republican convention or something like that, but he tweeted something with the president of Hungary, who is a white nationalist, essentially saying, grateful for partnership of the president of Hungary, who is leading the fight against Islam in Europe. And Yishai Fleischer is, he's an American who moved there from Brooklyn. He describes himself as a tough Jew. And what he would say is that you have to be tough in order to survive in the Middle East. And that essentially, I think he sees himself and the Jews of Hevron as sort of a vanguard that is, as Chalutzim Hadas, vanguard is sort of, you know, the Solalim or something like that, fighting on the front lines, right, for the Jewish people. And we heard from him. I can't say that he was easily or well received by our group, but we certainly heard from his perspective of how he sees himself. So Hadas, you can tell the next thing is the breaking the silence. And
no, but before the breaking the silence, I want to say something about Me'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the Machpelah, because you say that now it's open and it's fairly between Arabic and everyone who has his own religion can go there. But I want to say, because my role as a rabbi is to bring people in my people, like in the kibbutz, so that's reject the Jewishness, reject Judaism. They don't want, it belongs to the Orthodox people, and they have all these images of what is Judaism. And I struggle all my life, adult life, like bring Judaism to my society, to my secular people, to like the richness of the culture. And what I feel like places like Me'arat HaMachpelah, they don't give my people the willing to go there and to feel like it's connect to us. The opposite. What it's bring, like if that is Judaism, I don't want that. So I feel like when you say there is it's a privilege to, and I feel it's complicated because it's a place that was belong to Judaism and its richness and it's all its culture. But for most of the people I know, that they are Israeli and they feel like Judaism is, they have their image, stereotype, what is Judaism. Me'arat HaMachpelah is really take them very far from Judaism. If that's Judaism, to go to these places, to have this conflict, to be there, I don't want anything with that. And they go to Jerusalem and the Kotel HaMaravi, and this is people like, it's belong to us. But in Hebron, most of the people I know doesn't go there. It's not like it's make them connect to Judaism, it's the opposite. So I want to say that it's even more conflict. I don't know if I'm clear, because English is not my language, but I feel it's very strong. It's not just because of breaking silence and because of the conflict. It's all the complex that Me'arat HaMachpelah come with the settler, come with people like Ishai, come with people who are promote, like we have the right to be there, to live there, and they're doing it very strong and aggressive. So I feel sometimes that Me'arat HaMachpelah, it's not my place. I don't want to go there. And it's colored by this feeling, like very strong feeling that nobody wants to be there because it's a symbol of the bad Judaism. It's the symbol of not the good Judaism. I'm not sure if
Yeah, no. I totally appreciate that, right? So I think that and part of the dynamic, Hadas, part of the reason that I felt like it was so wonderful to do this with you is that I think that Americans sometimes, will go to those places, we'll go to places in Israel and, and sort of have that, wow, right? This is extraordinary. But then we'll follow that up with, yes, and therefore, we should never give up those places, right? But we're not the ones, it's not my children, right? I'm not a rabbi to people whose children are responsible for guarding those places and for the ugliness that goes with that. And Hadas, I appreciate what you're saying, which is like not only, that actually the effect of it is not only on the soldiers, but also that's not a connection to Judaism, it's a driver away from Judaism, right? That takes place in Israel. And I think that just sort of having an awareness of, that, okay, there is extraordinary history there. But also being able to say, so as we weigh all of these things, how much weight should that carry? How much weight, by the way, should it carry for American Jews to know that there's a whole segment of Israeli society for whom that's anathema, for whom that pushes away the approach to Judaism? And that's, again, my hope is to confuse everybody, okay? Because, honestly, the next group that we heard was a group, and it's not an uncontroversial group in Israeli society. It's called Shovrim Shtika. It was begun by soldiers. It means breaking the silence. It was founded by soldiers who served in Hevron and who, as part of their service in Hevron, felt that they were being asked to do and required to do things which were immoral. And this group went about collecting stories about military service and sharing them. I think part of what is controversial about them is that they shared those stories not necessarily through military channels, but they shared them with NGOs around the world. And so I think for some Israelis, they felt like it was airing dirty laundry outside of the state, and that, Hadas, what I would say from a diaspora perspective is that sometimes what that does is fuel anti-Semitism, or in other words, it fuels it's not fueling like, hey, something needs to change in the Israeli army, but it's fueling like, hey, we need to demolish the state, right? Anti-Israel sentiment. And the other piece that's controversial is also that not all of the stories are vetted. In other words, some of them are anonymous, but a lot of the stories are what I want to say is we heard from some of the soldiers, and I know and trust Hadas, and while there may be some inaccuracies, etc., there's a lot of those stories that are true, and we heard from soldiers who talked about the difficulty of their army service there. Hadas, go ahead.
Before this meeting, I went to look on their website. And it's interesting. You can look in their website, and they say about all the complaints that you describe, why to speak out of Israel about this. And they say because it's affect the occupation, and what happened in Israel affect all the world. It's not just in Israel. So they say they have the conflict if to speak about it outside Israel, but They prefer to speak about it. And also that they speaking true. They have really system that checking all the story. And they don't publishing witnesses that are not true. They check the story and they get the permission from the army to publish this story. So they're not doing something that is not insecure to Israel.
And Hadas, tell me if I remember one of the stories, just for example, was from a soldier who we heard from, I think it was that very day, and he talked about essentially, and I guess this would have been an H2, right? So the area under Israeli control, but Palestinians live there. And essentially they went and sort of woke up everybody at a Palestinian home in the middle of the night and had everybody come outside and went through whatever was in the house. And when he asked his commanding officer, like why did we need to do that in the middle of the night or something like that, the response was essentially that we needed to do it for deterrence, right? In other words, there's almost we need to make life miserable for the Palestinians who are living there to show them that we're in control, right? Yeah. It was I think part of what was so disturbing about it is that there wasn't necessarily like a good operational reason for why you would go in the middle of the night or why even that particular house. It was essentially intimidation, right? Yeah. And that intimidation, there was this, that it was an intimidation of that's how we have to do it in order to have this here. And this soldier spoke about how, obviously, that was very difficult. I'm just going to read, Lynn wrote something in the chat. She said, I'm not religious and I've never been to Israel, but I've been concerned from my youth for the safety and security of Israel. I really appreciate Rabbi Greyber's distinction between professing a need for change among Israeli soldiers and professing anti-Israel demonization, arguing against the right of Israel to exist. Okay, so I appreciate that. Yeah. And by the way, and Hadas, I know you're not deaf to those concerns.
No, I think I'm not deaf, and I think they answered this in their website. They are not connected to the BDS. They are not against Israel. They making the distinction between Israeli safety and Israeli the right to be. Definitely, I live in Israel. I'm a Zionist. I live here. My children went to the army. My father was an officer in the Palmach. Like, I'm very strong in Israel. But
you've got good Zionist credentials.
Yes, I have. I'm not support the BDS, and like it's affect me. But I want to say, and they say they are not doing it to the BDS to say something against Israel. They say about the occupation, and it's very, very strong. And I say about Judaism. I feel if that's connect to Judaism to be there, so this is not my Judaism. And it's very important to say that. My people, that I want them to love it, Judaism. It's important for me to celebrate, to have all this ceremony and the holidays. I want them to love that, to feel at home in the Jewish. And I want to say something very. After we came back from Hevron, I didn't sleep 2 days, really 2 nights. I felt like I don't know if you have the picture, like we went in the middle, in the main street, where was the market of the a lively market, and it all shut down. It shut down, and it's empty. The middle of Hebron, the middle street, and they're not allowed, the Arabic not allowed to go there. There is soldier all around. It's a place just for Jewish people.
Right, and one of the pieces that I think affected many people in the trip very, very strongly is that literally there are streets where where it's Jews only, right?
Yeah.
Where Arabs are not allowed to walk, and then there are other streets that are Arab only. And you know, there's
And
a lot of
we've been there. We saw that.
yeah.
We saw a few people going there, and everything is shut down.
So Hadas, just to come back to something you were saying before, I think there's so many interesting different things swirling here, right? Because what I want people to hear is that Hadas, right? Like Hadas is my friend, right? I love Hadas, and we get coffee and waffles together and everything. But she's also a colleague, and she, for me, is an ally in creating in Israel a Judaism which is pluralistic, which is creative, which is tolerant, which is sort of the best of Israel. And she is saying, hey, this place and everything that it represents is actually making my work as a rabbi that much more difficult, right? Hadas, what I want to throw out there to you is I have no, you know, when you say to me breaking the silence is not supporting BDS, I believe you, right? The complicating thing for, I think, the diaspora community is that oftentimes BDS or let's just say anti-Israel movements will co-opt the things that the criticisms of breaking the silence, and they will use it as ammunition to say the state of Israel should be, you know, taken down, or you know, for delegitimizing the state of Israel. And so that's, you know, that's complicated. And by the way, people who speak like Hadas in the United States will often be called anti-Zionist, right? Because Hadas is against the occupation, and yet Hadas is the one living there. She's the one who has children in the army, and this is her society and her country, right? And yet there are forces within American Jewish discourse which have no room for these sort of criticisms, right? So I just think there are a lot of different things. Let me push us forward a little bit, just because I have a good picture for this next one. So the next thing that we did on the itinerary was we met with Mohammed Wajlid, who is a former Fatah activist, and we went to his home. And this is a little, we climbed up the stairs and we went to his home and had a presentation on the roof from his home. His home is a fascinating place. It is what I'll call beachfront property to the Cave of the Patriarchs. It is right across from the Cave of the Patriarchs. And when I say it's beachfront property, what I mean by that is that you can look up articles and find that there was an Australian Jewish philanthropist who offered Mohammed, and he told us this story, who offered him $30 million, and then $50 million, and finally $100 million for his home. Okay, now look, I don't mean to insult his home, but I just want you to see, like, you know, those are the sinks and these are the bathrooms on the roof, right? This is not like gold-plated stuff, right? He was not offering him $100 million for his home because it's such beautiful construction. He was offering it because in acquiring the home, it would further cement the foothold of Jews around the Cave of the Patriarchs. here, Hadas and I, again, we may disagree on, but I'm just going to give my slant, and Hadas can. What's interesting is that Mohammed sort of said, my father turned down this $100 million because he is a loyal Palestinian and he has just as strong a connection to the Cave of the Patriarchs as Jews have to the Cave of the Patriarchs. And that was sort of his official story to it. My little commentary that is, and by the way, they also promised his father that they could get them set up in Switzerland or somewhere else with a wonderful job and sort of a wonderful life there. And Mohammed's father said no. And part of the reason that he said no may have been idealistic, but part of the reason he said no is may also have been that if he had sold to Jews, he would have been labeled a collaborator in Palestinian society, and he would put his family at risk for being killed. And I say family, I mean extended family, for being killed, sort of, and he probably would have spent the rest of his life sort of coming out of the door in some Western country and wondering if somebody was going to kill him and his family the next time that he walked out the door. So I think that there's a, there's an interesting tension, but what I want to say with all that said, Mohammed sort of spoke about the ridiculousness of living where he does, that as a Palestinian, he can't, there are certain hours when he can go across into area H1, and that the interactions with the settlers are sort of as bad as you can imagine they would be. And it's a bizarre and difficult place to live. And we heard from him, he also, by the way, is a Fatah activist, and Fatah is with the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas has some power within Hevron. And so he himself, and anyways, he sits in an interesting place, but I very much appreciated hearing from him. And that added another very interesting part to the story. Hadas, let me let you jump in, and then I want to talk about the conversation we all had back at Hartman too.
I think you describe all this conflict, like really why it was really special to be there, to see Me'arat HaMechpelah, to see the cave of the Patriarchs so close to him, and the describe of his life. Oh, here I play with.
There you are. And these are his kids, by the way. If you can imagine raising kids there. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Okay. All right, so the last one, Hadas, I think I just put you in all my pictures.
Yes, too much.
Do you remember what his name is, the guy who was our Milaveh Neshek? Do you remember?
No,
okay.
I remember he lived in a settlement.
Okay, all right. So the last thing that we did after all of this, it was a long, very, intense day. We went back to Machon Hartman, to our little paradise, to our little Disneyland in Jerusalem. We had sushi, we had some dinner, and then we sat around and we talked about our various experiences, and sort of the how everybody had just internalized and reacted to, and it was a really fascinating and interesting discussion that I was grateful to have. That the only at the very end of the conversation, right? So I think I included this picture because I wanted to remember. There was a moment. There's a woman named Yael Splansky, who's the rabbi of a very large Reformed synagogue in Toronto, who turned to our Milaveh Neshek. So Milaveh Neshek means the guy who went with us carrying a weapon all day, basically to protect the group, and said, Hadas, tell me if I get this right, but what I remember is she turned to him and said, after hearing all of these Americans talk and Canadians talk and a few Israelis talk, she turned to him and said, so what do you think? And he said, you don't want to really know what I think. We all said, yeah, no, we really want to know what you think. And he said, what he said something that I guess I would describe as sort of maybe an older Israeli attitude, but maybe not as old as I would think it is. But he basically said, look, you guys didn't like this guy, Yishai Fleischman, or whatever his name was, Fleischer, who was the settler guy, because basically what he said is, this is a tough neighborhood, and in order to survive in this neighborhood, you have to be tough. And he said, but you guys didn't like him, but I didn't think that there was anything that he said that was too objectionable. He said, his experience, he said, every day we wake up and there are many, many Arabs who are peace-loving, et cetera, but there are people who are waking up and trying to kill us. And we have to defend ourselves. And that may not be a pretty part of things, but it's the reality of living here. And, y'all need to know that, right? And I said something interestingly that day, that night in Ramot, which is not a settlement. It's in West Jerusalem. It's a suburb of Jerusalem, but inside the green, or inside the Green Line. There was an attack with a screwdriver, of a terrorist with a screwdriver, and who had to be shot. Like literally, that happened that evening. And so my experience of it was, there's a piece of what he's saying which is so difficult for Americans to relate to, but is a reality of the Middle East. That's like number one. And number two is, just so you know, by the way, Hadas, I don't know if I'm sure you followed the news, but a couple of days ago, I think there was an incident in Hevron, like very near where we were, right? And there's a part of me that also says, why should we be there, right? Because I don't want Hadas's children to have to serve there. There's a third part of me that says, but wait a minute, that was negotiated between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and Jews have the historical rights. And if we retreat from there, are we really solving anything, right? Are we just, increasing, are we sending the wrong signal about weakness in the Middle East? I don't have good answers, right? I know, by the way, Hadas, you should know, there's a rabbi in our community who was in the South Hevron Hills among, I don't know whether it was B'Tselem or somebody else, but she was like fighting against the settlers in the South Lebanon Hills this summer, right? And she's in our community, and I get it, right? Like I get it. Although as an American, I don't choose to sort of go and put myself, so directly into the middle of like one side or the other in that. But I feel like the conversation that we had at the end of the day sort of stirred the pot about, about the complexity and the tensions of the day, and left me, maybe I didn't not sleep for 2 days, but it left me with a lot to think about. And I came back wanting to share this. And even though there are not as many people on this recording as I suspected, I think that there'll be a number of people who watch this, because I think there's a lot of curiosity about it.
Okay. I want to say, first of all, thank you for having this session. Thank you for you to being. It's interesting me what you're thinking about what we talk. But I want to say that the reason I came, to this evening is, and I'm glad that I went to Hevron, and now I think I will go again, and I want to bring my people there, because I feel what's happened to us for 50 years of occupation, that we become tough heart. Like, I think what is most the difficulty is that we ignore. We don't see that anymore. Not many people will come to a session about Hebron. Not many people want to go there. Not many people see there. And I just had an interview with Alex Libak. He's a photographer that's got the Israel Prize. He's really ongoing. And he began to take a picture. And it's called it Behind the Fence. Because he say the people in Israel doesn't want to know what's happened behind the fence. We don't know to see the occupation. We don't want to see the suffering. We don't want to see it. We ignore that because we can't hold it anymore. And I feel like when I heard in this week by the radio interview, I thought to myself, I have to fight against my wanting to ignore that, not going to see that, not going to be there, not to see the complexity. I can't ignore many times, because if my child is a soldier and is going to the places like that, so I have to be there. I have to listen to him. I have to, but more. And I can live my life in Ifat, in my kibbutz, very nice one, in my nice people, and to ignore, not to speak about Hebron, not to see that, and to say, it's okay, it belongs to them, it's not mine. I feel we have to fight against that. But I want to say that I can't celebrate my Israeli life and my independent country if I'm occupied another people. If they're not independent, I can't live as an independent person. I can't. It's not true, because it's affect me. And I want to say that Hebron, it's very, very painful place that affects all of us, because we ignore people, it's more violence, more. So I brought a poem of Yehuda Michai. You probably all know this poem. But if you don't, I feel like it's, and he wrote it, Yehuda Michai, the poet. He was like with my father, fighting for this country. And it's called, I will share it, just a moment, if I find it.
I just made you a co-host so you can share it. Go ahead.
I think, but I don't find it. So this one, you see that. So I share it in it's called The Tourist. The Tourist is, but I read from the, Daniel, maybe you read, because my English, once I sat, you see that?
Yeah. Once I sat on the steps by a gate at David's tower. I placed my 2 heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets just right of his head? There's an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving, I said to myself. Redemption will come only if their guide tells them, you see that arch from the Roman period? It's not important. But next to it, left and down a bit, there sits a man who's bought fruit and vegetables for his family.
So I feel no archaeology and not any stones. It's more important than people life and more people freedom, and people deserve to live like me. And my mother was a researcher of the Holocaust. She came from Germany. And to see this empty street, it was really, I don't want to compare, I don't like to compare, I think it's different, but it was really strike me. Like if we live in Israel, in places, and Arabic not allowed to go in the same street as Jewish people, I don't want to, I can't accept that. Even though it's the most holy place ever for Judaism. So I feel I don't have solution, unfortunately, I'm not, but I'm fighting against the ignorance and against the indifference, like nobody really care anymore, because I think that's what Breaking Silence try to do. They try to fight against ignorance and against the people, and that's why they getting so many criticism, because nobody wants to see the mirror and to say, is that me? That's my... And what strike me with meeting them, the soldier there, and breaking the silence, that it can be my son. It can be my son, because the situation there, it's so strong, complicated. So it can be, even though he has his own value and his good heart, it can be there. And it can be acting to a human being, not the way I want him to act, because that's the situation. So I feel that's Hevron for me. It's not all this, that's Hebron. And you are not a tourist for me. You are my colleagues, you are my friends, you are really. So I don't see you as a tourist coming and doesn't care. I see you as friends.
I want to say a few things. Number one, if I can put some words into your mouth, I know that you don't want something like Hevron to cause American Jews to give up on Israel. And I think that, and I as a rabbi like to remind us in the United States that we have our Hevron, we have it in our history, and we have it in our places, and that when we hear about a place like Hevron, it shouldn't cause us to give up on Israel, and when we hear about those places in our own country, it shouldn't cause us to give up on where we are, and it should cause us to renew our efforts to have the sort of places that we want, and that, you know, I approach this conversation, you know, with Hadas, I try to just have humility, because it is not my children, and I do think Hadas, you know, that it's been said before that, you know, all of these things are processes, countries work and societies working themselves out, and I think Israel is in a place of struggle right now. And Hevron is a symbol, it's a real place, and it's also a symbol of the struggle for Israel's soul that's taking place. I feel like we should end with Torah, and so I actually think that what comes to mind is actually that this week's Torah portion is Kitetse, which means Kitetse le'milchama, right? And it's a very bizarre incident, not something that we love to teach our B'nai Mitzvah students about, but basically it says if a man goes off to war and he desires a woman, then what the Torah says is you have to cut her fingernails and shave her head and then wait for a month and only after that, then he can marry her, or he can have her as a wife. And on the one hand, you go, well, that's terrible. Like, how, why would the Torah say that, you have to do something like that? But I think what the Torah, certainly the Torah is trying to reform the terrible impulses of a soldier who goes off to war. And to me, what it's always pointed at is the terrible, terrible cost that war inflicts, not only upon entire societies, but upon soldiers themselves. That things are unleashed when you say your job is to go and kill. That there are, and that those are, we can never lose focus on the terrible cost, and that while we celebrate all of Israel's achievements and are, and pray for its soldiers, to be victorious in when so many of the battles that they fight are righteous and so difficult, and we can pray for soldiers' souls, that they continue to to be able to withstand becoming, as Hadas said, hard-hearted, and just acknowledge the cost that inflicts, while we also struggle with what to do and how to do this thing called the modern state of Israel. So thank you everybody very much for coming. I'm going to wrap us up right at 3:30 and to Hadas at 10:30 her time. Thank you for staying up. Toda Rabba. I'm going to turn the recording off. And